Behind every medieval king stood a queen, and often many more waiting in the shadows. Were kings really loyal to just one wife? Not even close. From political marriages and quick annulments to secret mistresses, royal love lives were tangled and ruthless. Today, we reveal the hidden truth about how many wives medieval kings really had, and why it mattered. Before we dive in, like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the untold side of history. Let's begin. Medieval Europe was a place where kingdoms rose and fell on the whisper of alliances, the birth of heirs, and the subtle art of diplomacy. At the heart of this world stood the king, supreme ruler, divine protector, and, just as importantly, husband. To modern minds, kingship conjures images of grand councils, battles, and stately crowns. Yet, in medieval times, a king's marital status often held as much weight as his sword. The question of how many wives a king had cannot be answered with a single number. It varied by period, culture, and most crucially, the Church's tightening grip on marriage. But before the Church's dominance, things were far more flexible. In the early medieval period, particularly among the Germanic tribes and newly Christianized kingdoms, kings frequently practiced polygyny, the taking of multiple wives at once. This was less about romance and more about politics. Each wife represented an alliance, often with powerful noble families or neighboring realms. Through marriage, kings stitched together fragile coalitions, secured peace, and ensured the loyalty of ambitious vassals. For example, Merovingian kings like Chilperic I of Neustria took several wives simultaneously. These unions often created rivalry among queens and confusion in succession, which was exactly why the Catholic Church began to intervene. As Christianity spread deeper into Europe, the Church slowly reshaped the royal marital landscape. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century and later, the decrees of Pope Gregory I made it increasingly clear Christian marriage was to be monogamous. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Church's ideal began to dominate royal courts. Kings were now expected to have only one wife at a time. Still, divorces and annulments were frequent, often politically motivated. This meant that kings could technically have multiple wives over the course of their lives, just not simultaneously. Consider Charlemagne, the great Frankish king and founder of the Carolingian Empire. Though officially Christian and a staunch ally of the papacy, Charlemagne was married multiple times throughout his life and took numerous concubines as well. Historians estimate he had at least 5 lawful wives over different periods and even more concubines, with whom he had numerous children. However, none of these women shared his bed at the same time as fellow queens. Charlemagne's marital history shows how kings balanced church doctrine with the pragmatic need to produce heirs and secure alliances. The trend toward formal monogamy became firmer after the 12th century. The Gregorian reforms, spearheaded by Pope Gregory VII, made marriage a sacrament and pushed monarchs to conform. In England, for instance, kings from William the Conqueror onward had one wife at a time. Yet this did not stop them from discarding wives if political winds shifted. Henry VIII's infamous 6 wives in the 16th century were a product of both personal desire and dynastic desperation. While technically not a medieval king, Henry's situation illustrates how monarchs still found ways to maneuver around religious restrictions, through annulments, divorces, and if necessary, drastic political acts. By the High and Late Middle Ages, the image of the king with a single queen at his side became firmly entrenched in European tradition, even if reality behind palace walls was more complex. Concubines and mistresses remained a feature of royal courts, but officially, kings were limited to one lawful wife at any given time. Still, outside of Western Europe, things remained different. In the Byzantine Empire, polygamy was officially frowned upon, yet emperors like Leo VI married multiple times sequentially to secure an heir. In the Islamic world, which bordered and often clashed with Christian Europe, rulers such as the caliphs or sultans openly practiced polygyny, permitted by religious law. Thus, the question of how many wives medieval kings had cannot be answered in a simple sentence. It depended on the king's religion, the age in which he lived, and the balance between personal desire and dynastic duty. To understand why medieval kings married, and remarried. So often, one must step into the world of court politics. Royal marriages were not private affairs driven by love or companionship. They were public acts loaded with meaning, carefully negotiated by diplomats, advisors, and clergymen. The choice of a queen was not simply about beauty or charm. It was about her bloodline, dowry, alliances, and the power she could bring to the kingdom. For kings, marrying a foreign princess often meant forging crucial alliances. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of rival kingdoms and ambitious noble families. To survive, or expand, monarchs needed friends. A wife could bring with her not just riches, but military support, trade agreements, and claims to disputed territories. The medieval king was less a lover and more a chess master, placing queens like pieces across a volatile board. Take the example of Henry II of England, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152. This marriage did not simply unite two powerful individuals. It gave Henry control over vast territories in France, including Aquitaine, one of the richest regions of the time. The union transformed Henry into one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, controlling more land in France than the King of France himself. Eleanor, though a queen, was also a calculated acquisition. Sometimes, kings married widows or previously married noblewomen to gain strategic advantages. This was common when kingdoms sought stability or aimed to integrate contested lands. The marriage of Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, to Beatrice of Burgundy, brought the wealthy and strategically critical county of Burgundy under imperial control. While the Church encouraged monogamy, political realities often created loopholes. If a wife failed to produce an heir, kings sometimes sought annulments, claiming consanguinity, being too closely related, or other canonical reasons. Annulments allowed kings to remarry legally, and thus, over a lifetime, a king could take several successive wives without technically breaking the rules. This was common enough that many royal families kept detailed genealogies to anticipate and avoid such issues. Concubinage, though technically frowned upon, remained an unofficial solution for kings who needed heirs but could not or would not divorce their queens. King Edward III of England, for instance, had a single lawful wife, Philippa of Hainaut, but also maintained several mistresses who bore him children. Though their offspring were often barred from succession, they still played important roles in royal politics and military affairs. At times, kings faced personal conflicts between love and duty. Some kings defied political logic to marry for affection, but this was rare and often frowned upon by nobles and advisors. The case of King Edward IV of England is instructive. He secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, for love. This marriage caused a scandal and infuriated his nobles, who had been negotiating a politically advantageous marriage to a foreign princess. Edward's decision destabilized his reign and ignited factions at court, eventually contributing to the dynastic Wars of the Roses. Not all royal wives enjoyed influence. Some were sidelined once they fulfilled their primary role, producing heirs. Others became powerful political figures in their own right. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of Castile, and Margaret of Denmark wielded significant power, not only as consorts but as rulers and regents. Still, for many, queenship was a burdensome role. They were judged harshly for failing to bear sons, often blamed for miscarriages or infertility, and sometimes discarded in favor of younger, more fertile brides. Thus, though kings increasingly abided by Christian norms of one wife at a time, the churn of marriages across a reign could be considerable. Political necessity, not personal whim, dictated much of a king's marital history. Alliances shifted, wives came and went, and the royal bedchamber became another battlefield where power was won and lost. By the High Middle Ages, the rules of royal marriage had been irrevocably transformed. Christianity was no longer simply an influence on kingship, it was an enforcer. The Church had become the ultimate authority on marriage, issuing decrees that turned unions into sacred, unbreakable bonds. Gone were the days when a king could openly take multiple wives simultaneously, as had been done in pagan or early Christian times. From the 11th century onward, the principle of monogamy, one lawful wife at a time, became central to royal life across Christian Europe. The Gregorian reforms, initiated in the mid-11th century, played a pivotal role in shaping this new marital order. Pope Gregory VII and his successors pushed to bring all aspects of Christian life, including royal marriages, under the Church's control. Marriages were declared sacraments, divorce became virtually impossible, and clandestine unions were forbidden. From this point, a king had one path: marry once, remain loyal, in theory, and accept the wife chosen for political or dynastic gain. However, medieval kings were still human, and supremely powerful ones at that. While they adhered to the letter of church law, they often bent its spirit. Though a king might only have one wife officially, mistresses and concubines thrived in the shadows of royal courts. These women, though never queens, frequently held enormous influence. Some even became the mothers of future kings or powerful nobles. Consider King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Married to Joan I of Navarre, Philip strictly followed church doctrine in his public life. Yet, his court was notorious for intrigue and the presence of numerous mistresses, many of whom bore him illegitimate children. Though these offspring could not inherit the throne, they often received noble titles, lands, and political roles. Kings like Philip understood that while the church could dictate public marriage, it could not govern private desires entirely. Some rulers went even further in pushing the boundaries of marriage. Philip II of France, not to be confused with Philip IV, became embroiled in scandal when he attempted to divorce his second wife, Ingeborg of Denmark, almost immediately after marrying her. Claiming he had been bewitched, Philip tried everything to annul the marriage, including marrying another woman, Agnes of Merania, before the church officially granted an annulment. The resulting conflict with Pope Innocent III led to Philip's excommunication and an interdict on France. Eventually, Philip was forced to take Ingeborg back, though she lived apart from him and remained isolated for much of her life. These cases demonstrate that even when kings wanted to discard unwanted wives, doing so was dangerous and difficult. The Church held the power to excommunicate rulers or place their kingdoms under interdict, effectively halting religious life across entire nations. This could lead to political unrest, rebellion, and severe challenges to royal authority. Thus, while earlier kings had shifted wives frequently with little consequence, medieval monarchs of the High and Late Middle Ages did so at great peril. Nevertheless, kings remained pragmatic. When dynastic needs demanded, they sought ways around rigid marital rules. The Byzantine emperors provide another telling example. In Orthodox Christian tradition, polygamy was forbidden, yet emperors like Leo VI the Wise married multiple times sequentially in their desperate attempts to produce a male heir. Leo's fourth marriage to Zoe Carbonopsina was controversial, and the Orthodox Church initially refused to recognize it. Only after intense political pressure was it grudgingly accepted, a testament to how even deeply religious rulers could challenge religious doctrine when the throne itself was at stake. In medieval Islamic kingdoms and among the Mongols, kings faced no such restrictions. Muslim rulers, for example, were permitted by Islamic law to have up to 4 wives simultaneously, and concubines were widely accepted. Mongol Khans likewise maintained large harems. Yet in Christian Europe, kings were trapped between personal desires, political necessities, and the ever-tightening grip of ecclesiastical law. By the end of the medieval period, the idea of kings openly taking multiple wives was largely extinguished, at least publicly. Still, beneath the polished surface of Christian marriage ideals, royal courts remained places of ambition, lust, and calculated unions. While church law enforced monogamy, medieval reality often challenged this principle. One of the harshest truths of royal marriage was that a queen's worth was largely measured by her ability to produce a male heir. Kings ruled kingdoms, but queens ruled the nursery. The consequences of failing in this duty could be devastating, for both queen and realm. Infertility, miscarriages, or producing only daughters placed enormous strain on royal marriages. In such cases, kings faced pressure from their advisors, nobles, and even their subjects to secure the succession. If a queen could not provide a son, the entire dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse. This grim reality often forced kings into desperate, and sometimes ruthless, decisions. Consider the fate of Empress Theophanu, the Byzantine-born wife of Holy Roman Emperor Otto II. Though she successfully bore a son who became Otto III, had she failed to do so, her position would have been perilous. Medieval chroniclers and court records show a recurring pattern. When queens failed to bear sons, kings either marginalized them, pursued annulments, or openly took mistresses in hopes of producing alternative heirs. Perhaps no king embodies this pressure more clearly than Henry VIII of England, whose desperation for a male heir led him to break entirely from the Catholic Church centuries after the medieval period proper, but in a pattern deeply rooted in medieval precedent. Though technically outside the medieval era, Henry's 6 marriages illustrate the same dynastic obsession that haunted kings for centuries: the need to ensure the continuation of the royal bloodline. Henry's situation had its medieval echoes. For instance, Louis VII of France, married first to Eleanor of Aquitaine, sought an annulment after producing only daughters. Eleanor's failure to bear a son, and perhaps her independent spirit, made her position untenable. The annulment was granted on the grounds of consanguinity, and Eleanor famously went on to marry Henry II of England, altering the political landscape of Europe. Louis, meanwhile, quickly remarried in hopes of securing a male heir. While public polygyny was outlawed, these successive marriages had a similar effect: one wife at a time, yet multiple wives across a king's lifetime, all in pursuit of dynastic security. If the first failed, a second would be sought. If the second faltered, a third was pursued. And so on. Annulments were not easily granted, however. The Church's criteria for ending a marriage were strict, but kings and their lawyers became adept at exploiting loopholes. Claims of non-consummation, consanguinity, or spiritual impediments were frequently used to free kings from inconvenient unions. Yet annulments were not always possible or politically prudent. When the Church refused to dissolve marriages, kings sometimes resorted to unofficial solutions, keeping mistresses or unofficial wives who, while not queens, bore children who could be legitimized if necessary. One of the best examples of this compromise can be seen in the reign of John of England, who, though married officially to Isabella of Angoulême, maintained numerous mistresses. His illegitimate children were numerous and, though barred from the crown, received estates, titles, and positions of influence. John's court, like many medieval courts, functioned with a dual structure: the official queen on one side and unofficial consorts on the other. Royal mistresses were often selected from noble families, further blurring the line between marriage and alliance. While not queens, they held sway over policy, court factions, and sometimes even succession debates. Some kings, particularly in France and England, elevated their mistresses' status to that of near royalty, ensuring their children's futures were secured. Thus, even as monogamy reigned publicly, the practicalities of ruling and dynastic survival created situations where kings behaved as though multiple wives, lawful or not, were essential. Queens came and went, but the royal imperative remained unchanged: secure the dynasty at any cost. As the Middle Ages drew to a close and Europe edged toward the Renaissance, the nature of royal marriage had been dramatically reshaped. The image of the king with a singular, virtuous queen by his side had become deeply ingrained in European political and religious ideology. Yet beneath the surface, the pattern of multiple wives, sequentially rather than simultaneously, left a lasting legacy, creating dynasties woven from complex marital histories. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Church's dominance over marriage was nearly absolute. Kings who wished to remarry had to seek annulments, or wait for widowing. Even then, the reasons for annulment were tightly scrutinized. Political necessity remained a powerful motivator, however, and monarchs found ways to navigate these restrictions. When annulments failed, mistresses became the de facto solution. They provided kings with companionship, political leverage, and crucially, sons who could serve as backup heirs. A striking example of this can be seen in the court of Charles II of Navarre, nicknamed Charles the Bad. Though married officially to Joan of France, Charles maintained numerous mistresses, several of whom bore him children. While his legitimate heirs were paramount, his illegitimate offspring often held substantial regional power and were used strategically to cement alliances or control unruly provinces. Royal mistresses were not merely secret lovers. In the late Middle Ages, they became almost institutionalized in some courts. The French kings of the Valois dynasty, for instance, established the role of maîtresse en titre, or chief mistress, a public position that gave these women significant influence over the monarch and state affairs. Though technically separate from the queen, they became quasi-wives in everything but title and church recognition. This system created a curious duality. Officially, kings had one wife at a time. Unofficially, they often maintained relationships that mirrored polygamous practices in all but name. Their succession plans reflected this. Illegitimate sons were sometimes legitimized, especially when no legitimate heir existed. Others were married off strategically, further embedding them into the noble hierarchy. Meanwhile, some queens wielded remarkable power despite this competition. Isabella of Castile, wife of Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled jointly with her husband and exercised full sovereign authority. Their marriage, founded more on shared ambition than romance, exemplified the ideal of the monogamous royal couple united in purpose. Yet even in their case, fidelity was not always perfect behind closed doors. Ferdinand fathered illegitimate children during their reign. Outside of Europe, rulers continued to practice open polygyny. In the Islamic caliphates, Mongol Khanates, and certain Slavic kingdoms, kings and emperors maintained harems and multiple wives legally and culturally accepted. Christian Europe, however, had chosen its path. Despite private contradictions, public monogamy was the rule, and any deviation had to be discreet or justified through complex religious and political maneuvering. So, how many wives did medieval kings have on average? Officially, the answer by the end of the Middle Ages was simple: one wife at a time. Yet across a king's lifetime, it was not uncommon for rulers to marry 3, 4, or even more times as queens died, alliances shifted, or heirs were needed. Add to that the ubiquitous presence of mistresses and concubines, and the picture grows more intricate. In practice, while simultaneous polygamy faded, serial monogamy combined with unofficial relationships meant that medieval kings often had many women occupy the role of wife, officially or unofficially, throughout their reigns. The royal marital landscape, therefore, was a tapestry of pragmatism, desire, politics, and faith. Kings did not simply marry for love, nor only for heirs. They married to rule, and in that realm, the line between queen, consort, and mistress was often blurred. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the medieval king's marital practices had become a curious blend of old traditions and new religious orthodoxy. Publicly bound to one queen, yet privately surrounded by lovers, advisors, and heirs of varied legitimacy, medieval kings left behind not just dynasties, but tangled legacies that still fascinate historians today. So, were medieval kings truly monogamous? Not quite. Through official marriages and unofficial lovers, many had far more wives than history likes to admit. If this story surprised you, like, subscribe, and comment below your favorite royal scandal. More shocking tales from the past are coming. Stay tuned.